The scorching sun melted the asphalt of the small Filipino town of San Isidro, as the faithful formed a long line that snaked outside the church of St. Francis Xavier. Sweaty bodies squeezed onto polished wooden benches, some receiving the touch of devout hands for generations. The cathedral, with its colorful stained glass projecting fragments of light like divine confetti, housed a special ceremony that Sunday, the visit of Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle to the local community. Dagoberto Manolastas, a man with sun-weathered skin and hands calloused from decades working the land, waited patiently for his turn. His eyes, deep as wells of untold history, carried the wisdom of his Aeta ancestors, the oldest indigenous people of the Philippines. The tribal necklace hidden beneath his best white shirt, the only one without patches, bore symbols that told stories older than the church where he stood. In the front row, Father Esteban Buenaflor observed the congregation with narrow eyes and thin lips. Known for his rigidity and strict interpretations of doctrine, the local parish priest was respected and feared in equal measure. His sermons about sin and punishment frequently left the congregation more terrified than consoled, but no one dared question his authority on divine matters in small San Isidro. Cardinal Tagle, seated beside the altar, noticed every movement and expression. His gentle, attentive eyes missed no detail: the restless children, the devout elderly, the exhausted mothers rocking babies. He had come for a pastoral visit, but something in the air seemed different, like that almost imperceptible tension before a tropical storm. The light from the stained glass painted faces red, blue, and gold as the communion line began to form. Dagoberto felt his heart race. 3 consecutive Sundays he had been refused, but today, with the cardinal present, perhaps it would be different. Perhaps today he could finally fully participate in the celebration that for him was not just ritual, but an embrace of belonging that his indigenous heart so longed for. Dagoberto's fingers trembled slightly as he advanced in the communion line. Each step brought him closer not just to the altar, but to a possible new rejection. At 67, his curved back carried the weight of a lifetime being the other, even after his conversion to Catholicism more than 4 decades ago. His face, marked by deep wrinkles like ravines carved by time, silently held the stories of a people who existed in the Philippines long before Portuguese and Spanish names were first pronounced on those islands. In Dagoberto's small house, a few kilometers from town, his granddaughter Mayumi waited anxiously. At just 9 years old, she had made her first communion the previous month, but her grandfather couldn't share this sacred moment with her. Inadequate preparation was Father Esteban's official explanation. Cultural contamination, whispered rumors that ran through the community when the priest wasn't around. The girl had spent the entire morning preparing a small celebration party, in case today was different. Cardinal Tagle observed the procession of faithful with that characteristic attention that made each person feel truly seen. His eyes captured the true congregation, not just the Sunday clothes and appearances, but the human hearts in all their complexity. He noticed the slight discomfort of the other priests when Dagoberto approached, perceived the look of disapproval they exchanged, felt the subtle change in the atmosphere. Father Esteban Buenaflor raised the host like one raises a shield. His face, normally impassive, now displayed a rigidity that bordered on discomfort. Between him and Dagoberto there was more than a simple consecrated bread. There were centuries of history, cultural clashes, theological interpretations, and mainly, the invisible abyss between power and marginalization. The silence in the church now weighed like lead as all eyes turned to that moment. Dagoberto's hands, those same hands that planted, harvested, and blessed his own family with rituals that mixed Catholic faith and ancestral wisdom, were now extended in a gesture of supplication and hope. His entire body seemed a silent prayer, a wordless question. Is this body of Christ also for me? Father Esteban's hand made an almost imperceptible movement, diverting the host away from Dagoberto's extended hands. A gesture so small, so subtle, yet with the power of an earthquake for its recipient. The sound in the church seemed to have been sucked into some distant vacuum, leaving only the echo of suspended collective breathing. That small movement denied not just a piece of consecrated bread, but Dagoberto's very belonging to the community for which he had worked for decades, building benches, restoring the roof after typhoons, teaching young people to respect both Christian tradition and ancestral wisdom. The old Aeta's eyes lowered to the ground, finding refuge in the worn patterns of the marble floor. There was no surprise on his face, only a familiar resignation, like one who recognizes an old enemy. His hands remained extended for another moment, suspended in the air like an unanswered question, before slowly returning to his body. The movement was discreet, almost rehearsed, revealing that this was not the first time this scene had unfolded. The other faithful averted their gaze, some from shame, others from silent agreement with the parish priest. Dagoberto's neighbor, Dona Lorenza, squeezed her rosary so hard that her knuckles whitened. Her son, Miguel, had received teachings from the old Aeta about which plants cured fevers and which kept away evil spirits, knowledge that saved the boy when the town doctors had given up. But now, under the weight of the moment, even she couldn't find the courage to speak up. From his privileged position, Cardinal Tagle didn't miss a single detail of the scene. His face remained serene, but something in his eyes changed, like the sea that remains calm on the surface while powerful currents stir in the depths. He observed how Dagoberto, with silent dignity, stepped aside, allowing the line to continue, as if trying to minimize the discomfort his presence caused, making himself as small as possible, invisible as his ancestors had learned to be to survive. On the bench, Dagoberto knelt and bowed his head in prayer. There was no anger in his gesture, only an ancient sadness, familiar as an old coat worn on cold days. The sun shone through the main-stained glass, projecting a colorful mosaic on his wrinkled face, momentarily painting it with the colors of the paradise that had been denied to him on earth. His tears, silent and discreet, reflected the light like small diamonds falling on hands that knew only hard work and generosity. The rest of the Mass proceeded as if nothing had happened, the incident with Dagoberto dissolving into the liturgy like salt in water. But Cardinal Tagle continued observing, his gentle eyes recording every detail, the way Dagoberto kept his head down, the manner in which other parishioners avoided his gaze, the satisfied pride on Father Esteban's face. For most, that Sunday would be remembered for the illustrious presence of the cardinal. For Tagle, it would be Dagoberto's resigned face that would remain etched in his memory. After the ceremony, while the faithful crowded around to greet the ecclesiastical authority, Tagle noticed that Dagoberto was silently heading for the exit, avoiding the crowd. The old man walked as one carrying an invisible weight, his slow steps dragging across the marble floor. His calloused hands held a worn hat, nervously turning it between his fingers, an old habit that revealed his discomfort. With a discreet gesture, the cardinal excused himself from the group surrounding him and moved toward the elderly man. Those observing the scene saw only a religious leader greeting another faithful, but what was really happening was something much deeper. Tagle didn't just see an elderly man. He saw centuries of marginalization, saw the persistent faith that survived despite rejection, saw Christ in the face marked by sun and time. Tito Dagoberto, called the cardinal, using the respectful Filipino term for addressing an older man. The gentle voice made the elderly man stop, surprised to hear his name pronounced with such respect. When he turned, he found not the imposing figure of an ecclesiastical authority, but the warm gaze of a brother in Christ. The cardinal extended both hands, taking those of the old Aeta in his, a simple gesture that crossed abysses of hierarchy and tradition. The silence that followed was worth more than 1,000 homilies. There were no grand speeches or public declarations, just the silent recognition of a man's dignity. The cardinal's eyes said what his lips didn't need to pronounce. "I see you. I truly see you." And in that moment, for Dagoberto, Being truly seen was a greater miracle than any other he could have hoped for on that Sunday morning. The next morning, Cardinal Tagle surprised everyone by requesting a guide to take him to the Aeta community in the nearby mountains. The news spread like wildfire. The cardinal wanted to visit the indigenous settlement, something no religious authority had done in decades. When he learned that Dagoberto was respected as one of the community elders, Tagle specifically asked for him to be his guide. The invitation, delivered by a nervous messenger, found the old Aeta working in his small medicinal garden, where plants sacred to his people grew alongside herbs mentioned in the Bible, a living fusion of his two faiths. The trail to the mountains was steep and difficult, but the cardinal insisted on walking like any common pilgrim. As they climbed, Dagoberto shared knowledge that flowed as naturally as the water in the streams they crossed. Which plants healed wounds, which flowers announced rain, how his people had survived for millennia respecting every element of creation. Tagle listened with genuine interest, recognizing in the elder's simple words a profound theology that spoke of the divine present in all creation. When they reached the small village, they were received with looks of astonishment and curiosity. Wide-eyed children observed from afar the figure dressed in colors that symbolized authority in a world that rarely acknowledged their existence. The visit had not been announced. There was no time for preparations or ceremonies, just the raw truth of a people living in simplicity and faith. An elder, Malaya, over 90 years old and guardian of tribal stories, slowly approached, evaluating the visitor with eyes that had witnessed almost a century of struggles. In the humble chapel of the community, a simple structure with a thatched roof and bamboo walls decorated with Christian and tribal symbols side by side, the cardinal witnessed something that deeply touched his heart. There, the Catholic liturgy was celebrated with elements of ancestral spirituality, not as a contradiction, but as a harmonious dance between traditions that spoke of the same God through different languages. Prayers in Latin mingled with traditional songs, church incense blended with local aromatic herbs, and Christ seemed as present there, in that simplicity, as in the most grandiose cathedrals. For hours, Tagle listened to stories of discrimination and rejection, but also of unwavering faith and persistent hope. He heard how many Aetas had embraced Christianity without abandoning ancestral wisdom, creating a unique and profound synthesis. He learned how Dagoberto, after being baptized, had built bridges between the two traditions, being respected both as a Catholic and as a guardian of indigenous knowledge. And he understood, with growing clarity, that the Eucharistic table in San Isidro's church had become not a place of communion, but a fortified border, defended by those who confused tradition with exclusion. That same evening, Cardinal Tagle retired to his quarters in the parish house. The relative luxury of the guest room contrasted painfully with the dignified simplicity he had witnessed in the Aeta community. Through the open window, the fresh mountain air carried the scent of night flowers and the distant song of insects, reminding him of Dagoberto's garden, where plants from two worlds grew in harmony. His hands absently leafed through the breviary, but his thoughts were fixed on the images of the day, especially the moment of denial in the church, which he now understood in its complete dimension. In his mind, connections formed between the theology he had studied at the best universities and the natural wisdom he had witnessed in the mountains. He remembered Pope Francis's words about a church that should be a field hospital and not an exclusive club for the perfectly healthy. He recalled teachings about the inculturation of faith, about how Christianity, since its beginnings, had always incorporated diverse cultural elements to express universal truths. What he had witnessed was not superficial syncretism, but a faith deeply incarnated in the reality of a people. Father Esteban knocked on the door, bringing tea and the schedule for the next day. The contrast between the two men could not be more evident. Esteban with his doctrinal rigidity, his almost militaristic formalism, and Tagle with his expansive compassion, his openness to the breath of the Spirit in the most diverse human manifestations. The formal conversation about commitments and schedules hid the storm forming in the cardinal's heart, while the parish priest spoke about the importance of maintaining traditions and preserving the purity of faith, Tagle observed how these same words could become walls instead of bridges. On the desk, among official papers and correspondence, rested a small gift that Malaya, the village elder, had given him. A rosary made of local seeds, where each bead represented an ancestral prayer of the Aetas, now dedicated to Christian mysteries. The object perfectly symbolized the harmonious integration he had witnessed, a faith that didn't replace culture, but transformed it and was transformed by it. The cardinal held it between his fingers, feeling its weight, not just physical, but symbolic, as he made his decision. Far away, in Dagoberto's small house, the family gathered for the evening meal. The cardinal's visit had brought a dignity that none of them had experienced before. Granddaughter Mayumi, with the innocence of childhood, asked if her grandfather could finally participate in communion with her. The old Aeta didn't answer, he just smiled, his eyes reflecting the soft light of the oil lamp. Whatever happened, something had already changed. Not in external structures or written rules, but in that internal space where faith finds its true home. The following Sunday dawned with a palpable expectation hovering over San Isidro. News of Cardinal Tagle's visit to the Aeta community had spread quickly, generating diverse reactions, from discreet admiration to veiled criticism. The church was fuller than normal, many moved by curiosity about what would happen. Dagoberto, however, was not among those present. After decades of rejections, his absence went almost unnoticed by most, except for the cardinal, who immediately noted the empty space on the wooden bench where the elder usually sat. The cardinal's sermon was simple and direct, centered on the parable of the wedding feast, where the original guests refuse the invitation and the king sends his servants to the streets to bring the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. His words, although gentle, carried a cutting clarity that made many in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. He spoke about how we often transform the Lord's table into a tribunal, forgetting that it is a place of grace and not judgment. Father Esteban maintained an impassive expression, but his fingers gripped the missal with increasing force. When the time for communion came, the cardinal did something unexpected. Instead of remaining at the altar, he descended the steps and headed to the main door of the church. There, under the astonished gaze of the congregation, he invited people from outside, street vendors, beggars, passers-by, to enter and participate in the celebration. Among the guests was Malaya, the Aeta elder, who had come to town to sell medicinal herbs. With the dignity of one carrying centuries of wisdom, she entered the church for the first time in her long life, followed by other members of the indigenous community who normally kept their distance from the temple. At the most solemn moment of the celebration, Cardinal Tagle elevated the host and pronounced the sacred words with an intensity that made each syllable reverberate off the ancient walls. "This is my body, given for you." His eyes scanned the diverse assembly, lingering for a moment on each face. From traditional parishioners to newcomers from the streets, from fervent believers to hesitant curious ones, from restless children to attentive elders. The message was clear. This body is for everyone, without exception. The communion line formed, now with a composition that the Church of San Isidro had never witnessed before. Diverse colors, ages, origins, and stories advanced toward the same bread. When Malaya approached, her uncertain steps supported by a carved wooden cane, the cardinal offered her communion with the same reverence he would show to any dignitary. The ancient hands, marked by almost a century of work and prayer, received the consecrated bread while silent tears ran down her wrinkled face like rivers on rough terrain. In that moment, centuries of exclusion began to be healed in a simple gesture of inclusion. 3 months passed since that historic Sunday. The changes in San Isidro didn't come as revolution, but as seeds planted in fertile soil, discreet at first, but growing with silent persistence. Father Esteban had been transferred to an administrative job in the archdiocese, replaced by young Father Jaime Reyes, trained under Cardinal Tagle's own guidance. The new parish priest's first action was to invite Dagoberto to become a permanent deacon, a process that would require proper formation, but which represented an official recognition of the spiritual leadership the elder already naturally exercised. The small chapel of the Aeta community in the mountains now received regular visits from the new priest, who celebrated masses where traditional indigenous songs blended harmoniously with Catholic hymns. A small medicinal garden was started on the grounds of the main church, under the guidance of Dagoberto and Malaya, preserving and sharing ancestral knowledge that risked being lost. The plants, arranged in a circle as in the Aeta tradition, symbolized the integration of knowledge that for so long had been kept separate. Mayumi, Dagoberto's granddaughter, now served as an altar girl in Sunday masses, her face radiant with pride as she assisted in the celebrations. Other Aeta children began attending catechism, bringing questions and perspectives that enriched the classes with different views on the same faith. The initially hesitant catechists soon discovered that these children possessed a profound understanding of the divine presence in nature, a lived theology that perfectly complemented the formal lessons. News of what had happened in San Isidro spread to other parishes and dioceses. Cardinal Tagle's gesture had become a symbol of a church in transformation, more welcoming and open to cultural diversity. In Rome, documents were being prepared to address the issue of Eucharistic enculturation with more depth and openness, inspired in part by what had occurred in that small Filipino parish. What had begun as a painful incident had transformed into a seed of renewal. On the last autumn afternoon, Dagoberto sat on the bench in the plaza facing the church, watching the sunset paint the sky with colors reminiscent of sacred stained glass. Beside him rested an official letter with the Vatican seal, an invitation to participate as a consultant on a special commission on indigenous religious practices. His calloused hands caressed the important paper with the same reverence with which they touched medicinal plants or received the consecrated host. The gentle wind carried the aroma of wildflowers and incense, fragrances from two worlds that, he finally understood, had never truly been separated. Like the broken bread he now freely shared with his community, his own life had become a symbol of union, not through grand speeches or theological treatises, but through the silent persistence of one who refuses to choose between his roots and his wings. If you enjoyed this story, leave your like and subscribe to our channel.